All right. So just a couple quick facts here on emotion. Right. So we're going to kind of go through. Today we'll go through some of the brain parts. Right. Some of this, a couple of you might have. We've broached the subject just a little bit, but I want to talk about it a little bit today. We'll start with just some of the brain structure stuff, and then probably in the second half of the class we'll look at maybe a few practical things, and we'll kind of go back and forth over the next week or two between some of the brain stuff and some of the practical applications. All right, so emotion is the Latin word M-O-T-E-R-E. Okay. Yes. Yeah, and probably motor is probably a good part of that, because this word means, you might know what it means? To move.
Isn't that something that they did that without even before machines?
Right. Well, yeah, so what it is then somebody then comes in with a machine to make something move, and they're probably going back to that original Latin and call it a motor. It's probably what that is. And so it's probably somebody going in hindsight, and saying, okay, let's name this after something. But it means to move, right? So the kind of the interesting thing is emotion is something then that moves you, right? So not necessarily in a physical way, right? Like the motor, like geographical movement, but it's something that moves you. Your emotions are an important part of action, right? So we know this from our marketing classes, and even if you haven't been in a marketing class, you have a television, which is like a marketing class. I mean, they where they teach you all kinds of marketing just on television. But one of the keys is if it doesn't move you in some way, then you're not going to remember it, right? And so most commercials try and reach some kind of an emotion, right? That if they can connect with your emotion, then they can move you inside. And if you are moved inside, then often that results in a movement outside to want to purchase their product or something like that. And so emotions are things that move us in various ways. So that's kind of a neat thought for what emotion really is and where we get the word. All right. And so I want to talk just a little bit on kind of the brain setup. And like I said, some of you have seen this before. This is obviously the brain. And so for some of you, this is not life-size. For others, it is. Yeah. And so there's what I would consider, and now, if you're a brain scientist, any brain scientists? Okay, good. If you're a brain scientist, you're able to, differentiate even more detail than what I'm about to give you. But what I would break it into is kind of three components. So this would be 1, 2, and 3. And don't judge my drawing. This is probably not accurate in any way proportionally. But so number 1, anybody remember what that is? Starts with brain, ends with stem. All right. Yeah, brain stem.
I'm trying to look at the picture.
Oh yeah, don't go by the picture.
Is that called a medulla?
Well, only if you don't like it. So we don't call names here. But so the brain stem, right? And so the brain stem is responsible for a lot of unconscious kind of things, reactions, body processes that you don't need to think about, right? So that comes out of the brain stem. Then this is the one that, if in some of our other classes we've talked about a little bit, the limbic system, right? And the limbic is associated with emotional response. Okay? And then you have the neocortex, which is responsible for rational thought. Right? So 3 layers of thinking that emerge from the brain. And out of these, there's all kinds of individual parts that make up these major systems. But this is kind of a breakdown of the major systems. You've got the brain stem that is things like if you touch a hot stove, your hand is going to instantly recoil. You don't have to sit there and rationalize it, come up with a thesis, to get your hand to move. It's going to do it almost before you even realize what happened. Your hand is already moving, because that is an unconscious reaction that comes out of this point. You don't have to think about your heartbeat or breathing. That would make sleep a very precarious event. And then the limbic system is, yeah, exactly, yeah, very short-lived event. So the limbic system then is the seat of all emotion, right? When you're angry, when you're fearful, when you're happy, when you're sad, when you're overjoyed, like class, things like that, that is all part of the limbic system. When you rejoice when your homework is finished, that's limbic system. And the neocortex is rational thought. When you analyze things, you think about things. A lot of times your emotions, you don't have to think about that. Am I happy? Am I sad? Did that just make me angry? And yeah, that did make me angry. Let me stir up an emotion. A lot of times the emotion comes first, doesn't it? And then you think about, should I be angry about this? Or should I have reacted that way? Should I have been as upset as I was? The rational thought comes later from the emotional reaction, right? And so often the emotional reaction happens, and then we think about it later. That's why people often have regret, and they go back and think, man, I shouldn't have responded that way, because that is the emotional part. And so this progression is not just physical, but that all of the nerve endings from your body funnel into this, and then go through this, and then go through this, so that the natural progression of thought follows this order, because that's just how you're hardwired. Your nerves go from here to here and must pass everything in between before they get to here, the electrical current, which is why emotional responses happen first. It is the first part of your brain that is triggered when something like that happens. And then often the limbic system will overshadow the cortex until things begin to calm back down and your glands begin to settle. That's why somebody can be really mad for like 10 minutes, and then when they go home, they think, man, that was dumb. I shouldn't have done that. Because this part is controlling it, and then as your glands begin to settle down, then this begins to take over. And these parts can actually, there are parts in your limbic system that can actually shut down, they have the power to shut down the other parts. So for instance, if your amygdala is in here, and if you, that controls fear and anger, and so if some snake comes out, instantly your body's going to have a physical reaction of some kind of fear, some kind of heightened sense of awareness, and immediately that has the power then to shut down this other system until you deal with the problem. Right? So that's why sometimes when you have something that's an emergency, you start reacting as opposed to analyzing and thinking. And so there's certain parts of your brain that this can hijack and take over. And so that's why sometimes you hear about somebody that gets upset, and this is a negative example, but somebody gets upset and they kill a bunch of people, and then afterwards they're thinking, I don't know what I blacked out. They'll say things like that, because the brain has the capacity under enough stress to hijack other parts and shut them down while one particular part is operating. So in order to understand emotional intelligence, this is a kind of a prerequisite of self-awareness, is to understand that emotions will almost always emerge first, and then your rational thought. So that means that you can't, once you're aware of this, then you need to be able to do a better job of not letting your emotions control your actions, because you're aware that you haven't had the opportunity to have rational thought about it. And if you will just wait, that's why people learn to just wait when they get upset. If you wait long enough, the chemicals will stop here and allow this to function normally, and then you can make a decision. That's why it's not good in any business setting or ministry setting or even at home to make a decision when you're upset, because the part of your brain that thinks correctly is not even working right then. you are operating out of this part, which is a very emotional part, and it may or may not agree with what this is going to tell you when it gets a chance to operate. And so anytime that you are having a disagreement or anything like that, or even when you're really excited, sometimes we get excited and say stuff that we regret later too. So whatever the emotion is, it's important to at least be aware of this process so that you can have a little more self-control, right? And so you begin to realize that your emotion is not the determining factor of every action in your life, because some people live that way. If you get them upset, they'll fly off the handle and they'll be mad, and they have no self-control because they don't have an awareness that the emotion is something designed to set the stage for proper thought, right? And so the emotion is not supposed to be the end. The emotion sets the stage so that you will think about something properly. And so the two go hand in hand, right? So if something upsets you, you don't want to take action then. You understand that that sets the framework that now I'm going to use my rational thought in such a way that I understand that was upsetting, and we have to deal with that because that was an upsetting emotion, but I need to deal with it in the proper way by letting my rational thought dictate what should be done given the emotional climate that this part of my brain helped me to understand that I'm dealing with, right? So if somebody upsets you, then you understand, okay, that's a negative thing that somehow we've got to deal with. My emotions are telling me that was negative. How I deal with it, though, has to embrace this part as well. And so I know it needs to be dealt with because I felt the emotion. How I deal with it is going to be something entirely different. And so emotions are there to set the stage for rational thought. Animals that lack the limbic system, interestingly enough, there are some animals, like reptiles, that do not have a limbic system. And so when their young are hatched, it's every man for himself. They will cannibalize their own young because there is no limbic system, which means that the limbic system in humans, this emotional seat helps to create family bonds, right? That the strong bonds between mother and child, between husband and wife, are formed out of this area. So the emotions help to create relationships. They help to create strong bonds. And so if we know that in parent and child and husband and wife, then we also understand that that can be an important part in developing relationships in the workplace and things like that. And so emotion is important, but it has to be kind of reined in by the thought process, right? So that's the emphasis of that. So like there's several lizard families that don't have a limbic system at all, and as soon as their babies hatch, there is no attachment. They will eat them if they don't get away in time. Somebody will come along and eat them. And so where there is no limbic system, there is no attachment. And so that tells us that the emotional part of our brain is a very important part to the relational side, right? And so in order to have a strong relational side, that's why the emotional intelligence is so important with how you deal with people, right? Because there's a lot of people that have a lot of head knowledge, that have no social skills at all, because it is the emotional side of your brain that governs those type of things. Whereas, you could have all the skills in the world and have all kinds of head knowledge and be very awkward around people, right? And so we've all probably met people like that. If you go to some of the leading tech companies, their tech guys are like, when I get off work, leave me alone. I'm going in the room, lock myself in there, and play video games. And they have no social structure, no social skills, because this does not govern that, right? This governs that. So that's why emotional intelligence, learning to manage this well, is the greatest contributor to relational success in the workplace. And relational success has a lot more to do with promotion than even this part does, right? And so what we're going to talk about here in a little bit, I may give you a little more on the brain, we'll see. But I want to talk about workplace emotional intelligence and some things to think about with that. Let me see if there's anything else I want to. Yeah, go ahead. Yep.
I know they say that the brain is not fully developed for that rational thinking until you're the age of 25. So that's the frontal lobe, right? That wouldn't be developed fully developed until you're 25. So therefore, the limbic system is what's making them tick.
Yeah, this is why. No, that is true. That's why young people often respond like teenage, like if you're in youth ministry, the videos, the human videos, things with an emotional element really work at that age level because they are operating much more out of this than anything. That's why they fly off the handle. They're very emotional because this brain is dominant and their brain really is still growing and developing into later age. That's why sometimes if you marry someone before their early 20s, you have to be prepared for the fact that their attitudes will be a little different when they move into their late 20s because there is still some development that goes on. Most of the time it's positive, right? I mean, if you're dating somebody because they're a party animal in their early 20s, you may be disappointed in their late 20s because typically people mature even more in those time frames. Yep.
Well, I do know, I've done a lot of studies on this because of the child that I adopted. When you're an infant, you are born with your limbic system is not formed. Is what completely forms that is the attachment that we need from other people. And when they don't get that, that's what breaks them. And their limbic system doesn't develop.
Right.
Any kind of therapy that you get for a reactive attachment disorder goes right back. It's all about feelings.
Right. And I believe that's why they say at a young age it's very good to touch them a lot and to speak to them a lot because the physical connections that they make have actual ramifications in their development. And so their body is taking in impulses very quickly. And this is why sometimes teenagers do things that don't make sense.
Really?
I mean, it really is. I know if, some of you that have teenagers don't understand that, but no, I'm just kidding. You know what I'm talking about if you've been around teenagers. But I mean, it literally is that this part of their brain is not functioning as properly as it will later in life. Some other things. Did I tell you how it's a myth that we only use 20% of our brain? There's a movie coming out where the girl takes some kind of serum that causes her to use 100% of her brain. So, did I tell you guys that? No? Okay. So that's actually misleading information to say that we don't use 80 to 90% of our brain. What it is almost all of your brain has a function. But at any given time, no more than 10 to 15% is being used for that function. And so it's not that 80% of your brain has nothing to do and it's just dead matter. If we could just wake it up. All of your brain has something to do, but at any given time, you're only using individual portions for the actions that you're doing. And so that was the original research was saying that at any given time, you're only using 15 to 20% of your brain, which then when you hear that, if you don't understand what they meant, you say, oh, wow, that means 80% of our brain is not being used. But that's not what that means. It means that in any given moment, you're only using individual pieces to perform the action that you're doing.
Another question I have was, I get the, when you have a reaction emotionally, and if you step back, for me, it's like a day or two, where I just have time to calm down, and then I can start processing what I have to do. But what happens in the brain, and you might know this if you've done research on the brain, but when, my example is, I came upon a car accident one time, and I'm like, I hate blood, I hate gore, anything like that, but I came upon it, stopped the car, jumped out, and ran over and just started helping at the scene.
Right.
And then when I got home, I fell apart. It's like, oh my gosh, what did I just do? So how did that override that?
Yeah, so the part in there that deals with fear and things, that is your fight or flight response as well. And so it has the capacity to take over the brain. So in flight mode, it takes over in fear and you're out of there, or you shut down or emotion. But in fight mode, sometimes you focus in because you have something very important that you have to do. So it has the capacity to either make you an emotional juggernaut, and with fear or anger or some kind of an explosion. But it also has the capacity, and it's not, even though you felt like you were thinking properly, it's not necessarily rational thought where you're analyzing things as much as it is a focused in the moment. And so it's not the whole neocortex. There are certain parts that are for that moment. Like when something happens, that part of your brain is engaged, and then your body goes into releasing adrenaline, which helps to focus certain parts of your brain.
But you aren't even really thinking though, right? You're just doing it.
Well, your brain creates an opportunity here in a certain spot that it will allow you to focus in on the thing at hand. And so you're not necessarily using rational thought per se, because you may do some things that are irrational, right? So let me give you an example. Mother is, say if that had been someone in your family, right? And the car is there and it's on fire. Rational thinking says, I could get burned, I need to step back, that kind of thing. Reactionary clear thought says, I have to save them no matter what the consequence. And so you can have clear thought from the emotion as well, if it triggers the right hormones.
Okay, so it's
Right.
still coming from the limbic.
It's still coming from the limbic system, but it will probably hijack certain parts of the neocortex that it requires it to make sure that you're moving quickly. Because this is, the limbic system, in particular the amygdala, is the most interconnected piece of the brain with everything else. And so it has the capacity to use other pieces as it needs in order to fulfill what you need in the moment. And so it can hijack certain parts of the brain, literally because it's so interconnected with its nerve things, that fight or flight mechanism literally has nerve endings in every part just about of the entire brain, so that if you're in an emergency, it can use whatever it needs to do what needs to be done. And so that's kind of interesting. And one other thing that I'll give you that I think is kind of interesting along these same lines is that fight or flight mechanism is connected with stress also in the body. That stress is really a smaller level reaction of those same chemicals, that it causes blood to go to different parts of the body as needed. So if you're going to you're on something and your body's reaction is, I've got to get out of here, it will literally send a lot of blood to your legs, which is why sometimes people faint when they're scared, because that chemical that causes it to go to their legs so that they can run faster will pull too much sometimes out of someone's brain, and it causes them to black out whenever certain things happen. And so one of the things I think is interesting is that fear, right, in this section here, that fear can trigger all of those stress-related chemicals, right? And in some respects, we need that. I mean, if it's like an actual thing to be afraid of, like a poisonous snake, you want to be able to have the razor-sharp reaction time that these different chemicals provide when they hit your body. Yeah.
What do you call that middle thing? A future what? You were talking about you said something.
No, it's the amygdala. AMYGDALA. And this controls the fear and anger responses in people. Okay. I believe it comes from the word almond. Like that's either a Latin or Greek word that has its root in almond, because it's a small almond-shaped part of the brain. And so I think that's where that comes from. But so the interesting thing is that fear and anger create these chemicals, but that is very similar to the stress reaction, right? So if you're at work and you're angry with somebody, then you have all of these stress hormones and things being released in your body. We all know what that's like. If you've had a bad day, maybe a run-in with somebody, your whole day is different because of that. You keep thinking about it. Your blood pressure changes. Your heart rate changes. I mean, there's a lot of actual physical reactions that happen because of daily activities. And it doesn't have to be something as dramatic as you got in a car accident or you saw a snake. It could be just daily things that aggravate you, release the same chemicals on a different level. And so many of these stress-related chemicals, you actually do your body a lot of harm by consistently being in stress mode, right? Which is why it's always good to make sure you take breaks. The Sabbath day is important, even though you don't do that to be saved and you don't have to do that. That God created the Sabbath for a purpose because He understands people. That's why Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man. It's just a way of helping you, because if you will be faithful with that, then God can bless the other. And I tend to view, in my own life, I take the Sabbath almost like how I take the tithe. That I know that if I am faithful to give God His portion of the tithe, that He blesses the other 90%. And that if I am faithful to take one day a week and spend it just seeking Him, that He is faithful to make the other 6 days more productive, right? But but the interesting thing is that this fear response produces stress. But that's not the only. The flight or fight is not the only chemical reaction system that your body has. There is another one called. Make sure I spell it right. Parasympathetic. Parasympathetic. Anybody ever heard of that? The parasympathetic part of your brain, or the reaction, is almost the exact opposite of the fight or flight mechanism, right? And so it releases things that cause you to be at peace and at rest, loving feelings. So I think it's kind of interesting. And it causes you to be agreeable, to be more loving, right? And so when you have that reaction, we've all been in situations where maybe you're at everything's peaceful. Maybe you're at a resort and you're more prone to be agreeable because everything's relaxed. You're looking to maybe when somebody talks with you, you're more open because you're not as stressed out. So there's these two different systems that are opposites. They don't operate at the same time. You can't be peaceful and calm and stressed at the same time. They are opposite systems in the body.
Are they both in the limbic?
Yeah, they're both in this region. But the parasympathetic system releases hormones that cause you to be more loving, more agreeable, more peaceful, more at rest. This one creates things that cause you to be stressed and on edge and can do damage to your body, whereas this is actually more restorative to your body. And it's been given so that if this happens, that's not all that you have, that there is a mechanism in your body to help restore what the stress is doing, right? The damage that the stress is doing, this one will restore. But the neat thing, I think, is that there is a scripture that says, perfect love casts out fear. And so even at a physical level in your brain, this system can shut down this system, and they are opposites even in your brain. That the fear system and the love system are two opposite ends of the spectrum, and that where love is, fear cannot be. That when you are having this, you cannot have this at the same time. They are opposites, even at a physiological level. So I just think that's kind of interesting that the Bible says perfect love casts out fear. And that is hardwired into your body as well. That you are hardwired, that you cannot have the fear and the love at the same time. Right? That they are two opposite chemical reactions in your body. Fear and peace. Fear, anger, stress are one system. Peace, love, relaxation are another system. And they are opposites within your brain, and they go back and forth against each other at different times in your life, right? So anyways, that's just kind of an interesting